Hello, everybody. Kevin Iole from Yahoo Sports here with another in our series of boxing interviews. I'm very happy to be joined today by a guy that used to be in my profession and then left that long behind and has become the Executive Vice President of HBO Sports, Mr. Peter Nelson. How are you, Peter?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
I appreciate you joining me. A lot to talk about today, so I don't want to waste a lot of your time. And I know most of my viewers think of you as a boxing guy, but you have varied duties in your job at HBO Sports. And one of the things I know you're in charge of is documentaries that might be on that network. And one upcoming one I'm really interested in. I wanted to get you to talk about it a little bit before we dive into boxing talk. That's about the Bill Simmons documentary on Andre the Giant. When's that going to be on? Have you seen any clips of it? You know anything about it that you can share with everybody?
I've seen the doc. We're very excited about this. Bill came to us a while back, said, there's never really been the definitive premium doc on Andre the Giant. We began conversations with Vince and WWE. They've been great partners the whole way through. Jason Hare, our director of the film, has done a tremendous job.
Jason's a talented guy, yeah.
Jason's a very talented guy. He came out of this shop many years ago, and he's gone on to do great things. So it was great working with him again. He's from my hometown, so you can't beat that. And we're looking forward to this rolling out in the spring.
Give me a little anecdote about Andre the Giant that we might see. Something that you can share that because there's so many stories. Some are apocryphal and some not. Tell us what you know, something you can tell us about the documentary.
You'll see a lot. You'll see behind-the-scenes stuff from Princess Bride. You'll see anecdotes that range from his career, a lot of things that I honestly never knew about where Andre came from back in France all the way through his career as he was traveling around, really before he even became known under the moniker of the Giant, which seems fairly obvious, but it came to him fairly late. So I think aficionados of the sport will learn something from this wrestling doc, but also it's a story about a man who at a very young age is essentially told that his life's not going to be that long. And to a large degree, it's a human story about how you confront your own mortality to a certain degree. And Andre did it in ways that really were endearing, I think, to the people around him. What we found throughout the interview process that Jason underwent with a lot of folks is that still universally revered and cherished to this day. He's really a special person. He was a very special human being.
And just to remind people, when can we see that on HBO?
So that's coming out in the spring, so it'll be out in April.
Okay, well, I'll look forward to seeing that one. That'll be one of the non-boxing programs I'm sure to watch.
Non-boxing program to watch, for sure.
Peter, I always thought you were such a great writer when you were a journalist. I mean, you wrote some fabulous things, and one of the things that I really liked that you wrote was a piece on Devin Alexander. And I don't know if you saw my piece recently where Devin admitted that he had an opioid problem. And I wonder if that surprised you. Devin was such a clean-cut, straight guy. And I was shocked to hear it from what I knew of him. When you heard that the former welterweight champ and junior welterweight champ had an opioid addiction, did that catch you by surprise?
I was really proud of him for speaking out. This obviously is an epidemic that's going on in American society right now. And you see it on headlines in the newspaper every day. And so for Devin to give voice to that in a way I thought was a really brave thing to do. And I have a lot of respect for him and everything that he's gone through in his path. And I'm sure on his way back and his comeback, he's going to make it back to the top and where he wants to be.
Do you still keep in touch with fighters that you knew back in your day as a reporter? Do you at all, chat with them?
Yeah, of course. And I'm very grateful that I was able to spend some time in my career early on before I got here, that I was able to spend time watching boxing at the street view level, in gyms, watching fighters train, sometimes working out with fighters, not well, getting ditched in the dust when we go on runs and that sort of thing. But it was nice then once you're dealing with it more from a bird's eye view, that you have that experience to rely upon to really think about empathetically what these guys are going through in terms of their training regimens, in terms of what's going on in their lives around them, in terms of schedules, in terms of them thinking about their own paths and their own careers. And so it isn't to say that I ever have a need to talk business with fighters, but it's nice just knowing them and, having remained their friend even on this side of it is a privilege.
Peter, I wonder how much knowing what you know about what it takes to fight. You were working on a autobiography of Freddie Roach, and being in the wild card as long as you were and seeing so many fighters. How do you use that knowledge to make matches for HBO that, you have a duty, I know, first to your shareholders, to the company, but also, to the fight game, you have somewhat of a duty as one of the major players in the sport. How do you use the knowledge you gained of what makes fighters tick and, what they go through to make HBO boxing the best it could be?
Well, I think what we know in terms of the adage of styles make fights, the old Teddy Bryant line, and carrying that through comes from really knowing how the fighters are going to look in the ring against each other. To some degree, you can't predict that, but to another degree, you can make an educated guess. And so it was an education for me, and I was fortunate enough to spend time. You mentioned Devin, his trainer, Kevin Cunningham, taught me a lot about the sport. Freddie Roach, obviously, was a great teacher of mine. So to be able to sit and just listen and not have to have the answers, but to be able to ask the questions is always one of the great things to be in a position to do in any field in life. If you're not learning, you're dying in some capacity. And so being able to see how different fighters are going to look in the ring, you get a much better feel of that watching a lot of sparring than even you do sometimes watching the fights themselves. So getting a sense of that, I think, was really a necessary, mandatory thing in terms of executing on this job to try to deliver stylistically fights fans want to see.
What is your responsibility in that job in terms of making fights? I mean, because I know ratings aren't what you are judged by necessarily as subscribers. So how, what is your responsibility in terms of, like, are you just looking to say, hey, we want to have big stars on network because HBO is a network of stars? Or is it, hey, we're just looking to have the absolute best fights we can put on whenever we have a date?
Well, there's a multitude of factors that go into any given fight getting made. But the overarching strategy has been to put on great fights that are coming from someplace that mean something in the present moment in the ring and are going to someplace in some capacity. And that can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different ways, but ultimately we're not a sports network, we're a storytelling platform. That's what HBO represents. And so to that degree, it's about the story that you're telling, and that has a lot to do with 24/7, My Fight, the fight game, the other ancillary programming around boxing, which we do to kind of flesh out the context, the meaning of the matches themselves, beyond just hoping that the fights that we are making an educated guess on are going to be good in the ring actually deliver. Sometimes they don't, for a variety of reasons. Almost no fighter goes into the ring 100%, and that's to their credit. They go through brutal trainings in order to get there, and they do their best to be 100% once they get in there. But sometimes, and I don't mean injuries, I mean sometimes they overtrain, sometimes they're slightly undertrained, sometimes last minute there's a digital scale instead of a manual one, and it throws them off at the weigh-in, and it gets in their head a little bit. There are all kinds of reasons why guys eat the wrong thing for breakfast on Saturday morning. So you always have to be patient with these things. But I think one of the wonderful things that we saw this past year with a number of upsets that occurred was that conventional wisdom sometimes was wrong. And that wasn't to say that we predicted what we would see. Quite the contrary. We just put a bet that we thought we were getting 50-50 fights or something that was closer to a 50-50 fight that maybe the general expert was saying the contrary about. And I think that's a rewarding thing, not for us, but for fans, because whenever expectations are upended, that's at the core of what makes great competition stand out for viewers.
I think boxing had a great year in 2017. A lot of great fights were made. When you saw Klitschko and Joshua with 90,000 people there, that's hard. The Golovkin Canelo fight was big for boxing. But I wonder about what the actual health of the sport is. Do we have anybody that's going to be that next transcendent star? There's a lot of great fighters. Vasyl Lomachenko, Terrence Bud Crawford, Errol Spence. I mean, there's a lot of really good fighters. But is there anybody out there that's going to be the next Floyd Mayweather, the next Oscar De La Hoya? Do we need that person, or do we just need to have a series of great fights?
Well, yeah, you know how this has gone in boxing, where when it's up it's the greatest thing ever, and boxing is back, and when it's down, boxing is dead, and so critics often can make poor morticians. So with great sorrow, many have said that boxing is dead. But if you go back even to reading Regency period England accounts of bare-knuckle fighting, in the 1820s, they're talking about how the fighters there are pretty good, but they're not nearly as good as the fighters from the 1760s. And so this is a natural human instinct to, in some ways, aggrandize the past in some capacity, which isn't to say that the fighters of the past aren't phenomenal, wonderful fighters, and that I still don't watch tapes of them. But it is to say that when a light like Muhammad Ali flames out, then Mike Tyson eventually comes up. And when Tyson's gone, then eventually you get the rise of Oscar De La Hoya. Now, who was the next Mike Tyson when Mike Tyson was burning out? I don't think anyone predicted that it was going to be a kid from East LA who wasn't anywhere close to the heavyweight division. And yet the highest grossing fighter in terms of pay-per-view numbers and his popularity and everything really proved to be Oscar over time. So I guess my point is that right now you might say, well, is there in the post Floyd, and as Manny's winding down his career, is there the next big fighter sitting there? And what I would say is that, we just saw with Canelo and Triple G with that fight, and, as they continue to quietly work away trying to get the rematch done, that was the first fight in quite some time where two fighters who weren't from the United States came together for a pay-per-view that delivered over 1 million buys. So the sport still remains incredibly vibrant. You saw, you named the Joshua Klitschko fight. You saw Joshua even fighting against, I think, one of his mandatory opponents that, or a last-minute replacement in Takam, that he was still able to deliver 70,000 people down in Cardiff. So there's incredible interest in the sport right now. I think, to your point, I think 2017 across the board, networks, fighters, promoters, everyone had a great year, and we're looking forward to delivering in 2018.
In all due respect to the 1820s and 1760s, when we had a lot of great fights going on, they weren't asked to pay $12 or $15 a month for HBO. So it's a little different scenario. And I guess the one thing, I'm not a big fan of pay-per-view, and I look at 2016, 2017 on HBO, 40 fights if I'm not mistaken, 10 of which were on pay-per-view. Is that out of whack? Would you like to change that? Having 1 out of every 4 fights be on pay-per-view, is that something we can look for you to try to change, or is it always going to be that high?
Well, I think where there is the public demand for a pay-per-view, you're going to see that the fighters themselves are going to want to take that risk, and as well they should. They have an opportunity to do it. They risk their lives in this sport. It demands incredible sacrifice. And so where they have a real opportunity to go from making, high 6 figures, 7 figures, to be making 8 figures, in 9 figures in some cases, they have an obligation to their careers themselves, their families, to take that kind of risk financially. Now, where there's opportunities to do more fights live and fewer fights on pay-per-view, absolutely, that makes the most sense. It makes the most sense for the fights themselves. It makes the most sense for the subscribers. So wherever we can, our preference is to have fights live on HBO.
And, I just look at it and I say, if I'm going to pay $15 a month for HBO, which, hey, I get other programming other than boxing, but, like in myself, my wife loves all your programming. I'm a boxing fan. I want to see the fights. So if I'm going to pay $15 a month, I don't want to pay $75 or $100 on top of that to get 5 more fights during the course of the year. So I don't know that, and you referenced boxing fans are demanding. I don't think they're demanding pay-per-view. They may be demanding guys fight. And like when I look at it now, Canelo, is he ever going to appear on HBO again? Not on pay-per-view. Is he ever going to appear on HBO? Is Gennady ever going to appear on HBO again? Isn't that a loss? Oscar used to do that periodically under past regimes at HBO. Oscar would be on HBO even when he was a pay-per-view fighter. Fought Steve Forbes famously after the Mayweather fight. Can you see a way that we could see Canelo or see Gennady back on the network?
Well, the example you just gave is a good one, and Oscar had come off the highest grossing pay-per-view of all time at that point in time, and he went to fight Steve Forbes live on HBO, Now, where there's opportunities to do exactly that, that would be great. What would be even better is that a fighter who's actually won on pay-per-view comes back and fights on the network, both as a service for their fans as well as to enhance their own brand. It makes perfect sense to do, and I think Canelo and Triple G have both proven to be highly savvy about their own careers. And so I wouldn't say that it's out of the question at all that we see them live on HBO again, maybe even in 2018.
So you have Danny Jacobs. He fought a very famous fight with Gennady, which was close. I don't know how. I sat next to you at the press conference that night, but I don't remember who you actually said you thought won that fight.
The Jacobs Triple G. Well, it was a close fight. Close fight. And what do I know about scoring fights, Kevin? I mean, someone had Canelo 8 rounds wide against Triple G, so, I'm not a professional judge.
Trump Tower is down the street. The politicians are a block away from where you are. Come on.
No, I mean, if I had to say, obviously, I thought sometimes you can lose the fight but win the night. And you definitely saw that Danny won the night that night. And, getting knocked down and coming back and delivering the way he did. And some fighters are like that. Some fighters, after you knock them down, then they fight 3 to 4 times better. And so Danny proved that night that he had the kind of resilience. He had the ring acumen, the switching southpaw, switching orthodox the way he was doing throughout the course of the night. Had Gennady certainly befuddled at times. And Gennady continued to put pressure the whole night and never rested to be able to say, well, I have this in the bag. So I give both fighters a lot of credit, but at the end of the day, scoring-wise, I had Gennady edging it out.
Okay. Do you feel like there's a chance that Danny could fight either one of the big 2 middleweights on the network, not on HBO? We know that the Gennady-Jacobs fight, which had a great undercard fight too, Chocolatito and Rungvisai, and it was one of the Fight of the Year contenders, certainly, did not perform that tremendously on pay-per-view. So is there a chance on the network we could see Danny against one of those 2 guys?
Yeah, I think it's conceivable. I think we have to see what happens if this rematch ends up coming together or not. And then once we know that, and then we're on the other side of that, we'll be looking at that in the fall for sure. But, like I said, I think Canelo, if Canelo were to get past Gennady in the rematch, then I would hazard a guess that we wouldn't see Canelo back on HBO in the fall against a top-flight caliber opponent like Danny Jacobs. But that said, Gennady certainly has expressed an interest of continuing to fight live on HBO, and it wouldn't shock me if that was something that was on the table.
Okay. I know we're pressed for time, so we'll get this wrapping up fairly.
How much time are you pressed on time?
I am not pressed on time.
All those books in the background. I got nothing back here.
I got Evander Holyfield signed gloves and James Toney signed gloves. That's all I have back there.
That's great. That's not bad.
I'm not complaining. But, just to follow up a little bit on, you lost Top Rank as a provider. And I think, if you look over the last 50 years that Bob Arum has been promoting boxing, nobody has been as consistent as producing big stars as Bob Arum has done. We know Kathy Duva made a comment, and I agree with it to a large degree, at the Kovalev Ward press conference. She said in the last 30 years, every single big star has been built on HBO. But given the loss of Arum to ESPN, and Showtime is really spending a lot of money and promoting some really good fights, do you feel like in the next 10 years that a promoter will be able to make the same comment that all of the big stars in the preceding 10 years have been made on HBO?
That's a great question. I mean, time will tell. But, look, Bob is a legend, and he hasn't just been a legend for his work with Muhammad Ali. He worked with Marvin Hagler. He worked most recently, if you take a look at the fighters he developed, everyone from Oscar De La Hoya, Floyd Mayweather, Miguel Cotto, a lot of the brightest lights of the last 15, 20 years were developed by Top Rank. You have to give them immense credit for what they do and who they are and their history. At the same time, you see a plethora of promoters in the industry right now, and great talent can come from anywhere. And we have a proven track record that we're willing to work with absolutely anyone, including Top Rank. And just recently we had Jason Sosa on a show that we had at the Theater at the Garden, who's jointly promoted by Top Rank. So as far as we're concerned, our phone lines are open. We're willing to talk to absolutely anyone. We want to make the fights that people want to see, and we're not interested in having any kind of noise or atmospheric politics get in the way of that in any capacity. So everyone in this sport wants to see it succeed. People have disagreements. They have difference of opinion. The large problem with the disaggregation of all the different promotional units in boxing is that what you often find is that everyone is working in the same sport, but they're almost all working in a different business. They all have their own different business model. And so getting people to work together is really where we see again and again the fights get made that fans want to see. Almost every big fight that you can name came together because different parties from disparate realms were able to see each other eye to eye. And we don't look to stand in the way of that. We look to facilitate that. And every chance we can, we're going to do that.
So you'll lead me into a question about Dana White, but before I bring that up, I want to ask you one thing about your ratings this year or last year. I know there was stories written at the end of the year that 16 or 17 of the top 20 premium cable shows were the highest rated were on HBO. I thought, it's kind of a little disingenuous story because, ESPN certainly came in and made an impact with their ratings. But also, and this is a disappointment to me as a boxing fan, I don't think on the 20 highest rated premium cable shows, there was one show that averaged 1 million viewers. For as great a year as it was, does that concern you that, I think that's the first time I can remember that happen where not one show on premium cable in an entire year, Showtime or HBO, averaged 1 million. Does that concern you, Peter?
Well, again, you can take a look at the data a couple different ways. One is exactly how you're framing it. The other is that you saw immense interest in this sport rally around a couple marquee events for sure. And so this has been a year, last year, that had 2 events that were tsunamis with the Mayweather-McGregor fight and Canelo Triple G. But then you also saw a tidal wave of retirements occur. So, I think Marquez retired last year.
Yep. Certainly
Tim Bradley did. Vladimir Klitschko did. Andre Ward did. Miguel Cotto did. And so there's been a transitional year that's been occurred between an older guard and a newer guard that's starting to come up. Now, some of those guys had to do their final retirement fights, that sort of thing. That took some oxygen out of the way for some of the younger generation. But I have little doubt that the health and sanctity of boxing is going to be in good shape for many years to come.
Well, I'm going to read you a quote from your counterpart at Showtime, Steven Espinoza, and I know he's a favorite of Dana White, who we're going to talk about in a second. I know you're not on Twitter, but I'm sure you have heard about the little battles between Dana and Steven and Conor McGregor. But Steven, this was a quote to the LA Times, I think at the end of 2016 or beginning of 2017, I wanted to get your reaction to. He said, "I don't think it's a question anymore. If we look at what has gone on in the recent past in terms of the quality, quantity, and competitiveness of the boxing programming, along with our shoulder programming, we have clearly established that we are the market leader. More importantly, I think we've shown we are going to be the market leader for the future. Our commitment is stronger than any network in the sport." Does Showtime have a stronger commitment to boxing than HBO?
I think we're immensely committed to boxing, Kevin. We have a 40-year-plus track record in the sport. We have demonstrated again and again, year after year, as people in the early months of the year ask these types of questions, and then they reflect back at the end of the year. I don't think anyone would say anything other than that HBO, in terms of boxing, had a stellar 2017. So that's our bar. We always want to exceed the fans' expectations. We always want to lean in to listen to what the fans actually have to say, the fights that they want to see, and try to get those fights made. As far as, I'm more of a let a million flowers bloom type of guy. So in terms of different people doing well in the sport, I wish them all well. It's good for the sport itself. I don't root against the sport anywhere. So I think that's our mantra. What we want to do is see the sport succeed. That leads to fighters becoming bigger stars. That leads to bigger fights getting made. And we have a proven track record that a lot of those fights end up happening with us.
So I'm not sure if you saw my interview with Dana White from last week. We talked a lot about boxing. He made it fairly clear that he wasn't going to be working with Showtime. A, what is your thought process on Dana White, an MMA promoter, getting into boxing? And B, have you had any conversations? I know you guys are friendly and text and have some contact, but have you had any substantive conversations with him about promoting shows on HBO?
Dana is still looking in early days in terms of what he wants to do in the boxing space. We have. He and I talk, as you just said. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Dana. I don't think there's any refuting that he was able to do in just about 15 years what no boxing promoter has been able to do in decades and decades. So in terms of building a brand that is unified for a sport that really has created a distinct market leader in terms of the category. And you got to give him a lot of credit, and anyone who underestimates Dana does so at his own peril.
So, any talks about being on HBO in 2018 or beyond that?
Like I said, we talk to everybody. So when Dana has a fight to propose, you can guarantee that if he's not calling me, I'll be calling him.
Okay. And then lastly, one of the reasons I think that they've been successful is what they did from the beginning was they said, hey, let's have evenly matched fights up and down our card. And they deliver those kind of evenly matched fights. And that seems like, I was critical of ESPN's programming with Top Rank for, not for putting Shakur Stevenson and Michael Conlan on the air, but for putting them on fights where we knew that they were going to be 1 or 2 run fights and what I call a squash match. How do you avoid that? Hey, Kovalev fought Andre Ward twice, so I had no problem with him coming back to fight Shabransky. I have a little bit of a problem with the fight March 3rd, McCallum. I don't look at him as a competitive guy with Kovalev. So how do you avoid those kind of fights where, you're going to go in there and we know, hey, unless there's something major crazy happens, it's going to be a big blowout, knockout fight. How do we avoid that and get back to what you said earlier, closer to 50-50 fights?
Well, I'll give you the answer you don't want, and I'll give you the answer you do want, which is the answer you don't want is that what we saw last year was that there were a number of these types of matches that were made, whether it was Salido Roman, whether it was Cotto Ali, and what you saw was that the underdog not only outperformed expectations, he actually beat the A side. And in boxing, that's obviously what brings people in, is that anything can happen, and that there are people who, working from the underdog position, love doing that because they love to outperform the expectations. At the same time, as we take a look at that fight, yeah, I completely understand your perspective on it, and I think that whenever there's an opportunity to do better, we need to. At the same time, I think when you take a look at the fragmentation, the balkanization of boxing right now, where there are a number of A sides that are sitting in a couple of different verticals across the medium, what you find is that their opponent pools become relatively constricted. And so that's difficult for everyone. But you always do your best to find the absolute best opponent out there, and the one where if you can't make something that you think going in is going to be a 50-50 fight in terms of what the press expectations are going to be, that at least you think in the ring is going to deliver, and that the fighters themselves, always the best litmus test, Kevin, is that the fighters themselves actually want to take the fight. Whenever you're trying to convince, even if they might be the A side, they might be the best opponent in the world, but if the fighter himself doesn't actually want to take the fight, that has a proven history of leading to fights that I would never want to see again. So I give Igor credit. He decided that he wanted to take the fight. He's stepping in the ring against a monster in Sergey Kovalev, and we're going to see what he has on March 3rd. And by the way, I think that the undercard of that fight, the co-feature, is a terrific event between the champion, Bivol, against Sullivan Barrera. So I'm excited to see that one.
And we'll end with this. Kathy Duva on November 25th, after the Shabransky fight, said Kovalev will be back on the network on March 3rd. My biggest objection to all promoters is when they say that, because you're giving them a date without an opponent. Why should any promoter, I don't want to single out Kathy, but this is just a specific example, why should any promoter have a date when you don't have an opponent in hand? Should you not, as the head of HBO Boxing, say, okay, when you have a fight, come to me with that fight, not, hey, he's going to fight on May 3rd and we'll figure out the opponent later, because then that leads to the kind of fights that I think both you or I don't want to see.
You're 100% right, and I'll just leave it at that. No, I'm kidding. What I will say is that most often when promoters go out and say they have a date, they are doing that usually in a rogue state. That usually isn't done with any conferring with us. We don't assign dates, we assign fights. We don't program a date, we program a fight. Okay. And so sometimes promoters, I think, can get a little bit ahead of themselves on that sort of thing. But that isn't to say that in this instance that's what happens. Sometimes you also have multi-fight agreements, which we do with Kathy and Sergey. And so we know we're going to be doing a fight sometime in the spring with Sergey, just as we know we're going to do with Canelo Alvarez, just as we know we're going to do with others. And so I think, to go back to what I was just talking about in terms of different fighters being spread out, across different networks, what you see is that there is more of a tendency to do multi-fight agreements that lead to promoters having some assurance that they will have a date in some capacity. I think from a competitive standpoint, you're absolutely right. Ideally, no one would have any kind of multi-fight agreement or anything like that so that they can't rest on the laurels with that. What I will say with a fighter like Sergey Kovalev, you certainly don't worry about it because he's willing to fight absolutely anyone in the world. And so you have to be judicious about with whom you decide to do a multi-fight agreement where they're going to have a guaranteed date, because you have to make sure that those people want to fight anyone in the world. Otherwise, you wind up with people fighting firemen and that sort of thing, and generally people resent that and they don't want to see it.
Well, I appreciate that, and we know who the fireman was. Did great. Hey, Peter, I appreciate you being on. What's up next on HBO Sports?
On January 27th, we have a two-title doubleheader with Linares defending his lightweight title in the co-feature with Matisse fighting for a welterweight title in the main event. On Feb 24, we have the return of the Superfly Spectacular, so we're going to have a triple header that night, headlined by Sor Rungvisai, who was in Fight of the Year candidate last year against Chocolatito.
And knockout of the year, right?
Of the year as well. There's an interesting story with him, which is that his promoter found me. I was talking at a university campus, and this kid came up to me, started asking me all these detailed questions about sanctioning bodies and that sort of thing. And I was like, I didn't even do my homework when I was in college, better yet than know intricate details like this. And he worked for a promotional company in Thailand. And he said, well, I think we have a fighter for you who would be a great opponent for Chocolatito. And I said, okay, great. Give me your email and we'll figure it out. And 6 months later, there you go.
He was right.
Fighting in that Fight of the Year candidate. And so in March, we have the Kovalev-Bivol doubleheader, two lightweight titleists fighting on the same show. April, my belief is that we'll see the return of Danny Jacobs. And then in May, we're all hunkered down here, knocking on wood, hoping that we see the rematch. So we'll see.
Golovkin and Canelo, too. Let's hope we see that.
I'd be remiss if I didn't plug again what you did so kindly for us at the top of this with the Andre the Giant documentary that we have happening in April. So
we will look forward to that. Yeah. Peter, I appreciate you very much. Thanks for coming on. Best of luck this year, and thanks for everything.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I appreciate it.
You're the man.